Okay, so I'll record this and I'll send it out later. So today we're going to talk about the Reconstruction period. And I've touched on this before. Um, it tends, although not for a while, so I don't think with you folks, but the Reconstruction tends to be a period of time that some people missed. Actually, it doesn't get taught a lot in school. What happens is well, I mean, elementary school, junior high, social studies and history can be kind of all over the place. And most, if anything, like I have a son in sixth grade right now, and they just jump around. It's not really like a history class, right? So by the time you get to a real history class, you have to be in high school, um, and even there, it's kind of hit or miss. But what happens is sometimes ninth grade high school, um, in America, you have like it starts even with the Native Americans, and then the colonies, which we've all talked about, and then the American Revolution, and then you finish the year with the Civil War.
Right.
And then sometimes if there is like a second, if in 10th grade, sometimes if they pick back up with the American history, they kind of just pick up with like World War One, World War Two, I don't know. And then it actually kind of all falls apart. If anything, it's like I don't know, in my experience and from what I've seen in like American history teaching, middle school, high school, they really do focus on the American Revolution, which is
Russian, yeah.
important. And then they get to and then like that you end in May and June with the Civil War. Everybody's excited about the Civil War. So what always gets totally forgotten, and sometimes you can go your whole education without hearing about, is the Reconstruction period, which is the 10 or so years immediately after the Civil War. Okay. So is anybody familiar with the Reconstruction period?
Think I am.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Hey, how you
Um,
doing?
good. Good. Oh, I see Jendaya and Guisha logged in. Okay. I got to scroll down to see that here. Um, okay. Yeah, I'm good, Jendaya. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. And yourself?
Good. Good. Good.
It's nice today.
It
Spring
is.
is
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
like
Oh
it's all
yeah.
looks like it's already here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a nice taste of
Mhm.
spring we got here.
The
Mhm.
birds think it's spring. Let me tell you, they're all on the trees out
Yeah.
front of my house,
Uh,
twitter pated,
Yeah,
freaking
it
out.
was it was when I went to work with my brother on Tuesday. It was just warm. We didn't need a jacket.
Yeah. Oh
mm,
yeah.
So
It
nice.
was. It was nice.
yeah.
I know you can
That's
open the windows now without freezing to death.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
I opened
Yes, you
my
can.
screen door the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Nice.
right.
Mhm. No, it's amazing what that does for your mood too. Like it's just
Oh yeah.
you're it just feels less oppressive and
Feels
Yes.
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, for
Oh,
sure.
Feel awesome.
mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, if your mood is not all that good in the winter, yeah, you need to really be you need some really nice weather to make you feel happy, make your mood good. That's
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
we need the vitamin D. I mean,
Mm,
we're all going to come out of the house after a pandemic.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, that
Oh yeah.
too. Yeah.
Hmm.
Ugh.
Mm,
I mean,
Hmm.
we've really, when you think about it, I think we've all really sat inside more than we've done anything else in the past year.
it.
mhm.
As
I
of
just
today, they say today is the day they marked it official, that we were
Yeah.
in a pandemic.
Hmm.
Because I know I've been in the house now as of tomorrow for 365.
Yeah.
Oh.
now I just want you to know that I read an article after my mom said it, and she said that the CDC was saying that people who are fully vaccinated, really fully vaccinated, y'all could do some things that you used to do
Right.
before when before the pandemic came. You can gather indoors and do all the good stuff without
Hmm.
social distancing and wearing masks. You remove your masks.
I
Mhm.
don't know if I'll remove my mask, but I will get back to life as long I have to wait until my little one is vaccinated. So I have to wait until they come out with a vaccine for underage children, like preschool age, because she
Mhm.
has like high risk chronic lung disease.
Oh,
Mm.
okay.
So
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
yeah,
well, they didn't really say everybody. They just said
yeah,
those who were fully vaccinated. I don't know if you,
Hmm.
oh, I don't know.
the Irish though, you can
I
be
don't,
fully vaccinated with a 66%, a 96%, or a 95%, right?
right.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you will not get COVID. It just means that in the chance that you do, you have a better chance of fighting it because your body recognizes the
Mhm.
disease. That's what the RNA is for. It's teaching your body to bring cells to attack that virus. So that way, if you do come in contact with it, more than likely it would be more like a common cold rather than a death sentence.
That's right. Now,
Right.
So
Yeah. It won't be as
now,
severe. Yeah.
well,
vigilantly,
well,
right,
I,
vigilantly try to wear your mask if you're around a lot of people, but your
Mhm.
family, take the risk because it's your family.
well,
Yeah.
I didn't say I didn't say really that they said everybody when you're fully vaccinated. I know, but now I don't now unvaccinated people can still wear masks, but those who are fully vaccinated, they said they can remove it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
In
interesting.
certain, I think when you go
That's
out
like
in a
so scary.
crowd, everybody's still supposed to, or but no, it's the changes are happening, and it's exciting.
It's a good thing. Yeah, it's better than being locked down.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So no, it's good.
Well, good
So
morning, everyone.
yeah. So the Reconstruction is the time period immediately after the Civil War. Okay, so let's talk about the Civil War for a minute. Okay, Civil War is 1861 to 1865. We know it's a battle between the North and the South, right?
Right.
Um, let's pull up a Civil War map. Okay, so here's just kind of a generic Civil War map. The red are the states that seceded from the Union being the United States, right? So they seceded because of, well, some people say because of states' rights. They wanted those states to have the right to do certain things, that the federal government was keeping them from making that decision. Um, well, the southern states, the 11 southern states seceded in order to continue to practice their right of what? They wanted the right to make their own decision about what topic?
Slavery.
Slavery. Okay, so it's really, I mean, really is about slavery. So the central topic of the Civil War is slavery of Africans and African Americans in the South. Now, the blue is states, the gray is area that at the time was not states, it was territories, okay, because we didn't have 50 states yet. The dark blue is just states that didn't secede. The light blue are border states. We call them border states. They are states that did have slavery, but did not secede from the Union. And a lot of people don't know that. They think, oh, well, all the slave states seceded and became the Confederacy, right? They wanted to be their own new country called the Confederate States of America. Not a very, not a very creative name, but uh, I grew up thinking, oh, the slave states were the ones that ran away, that seceded. But that's not true. There were these light blue border states. They bordered the North and the South. They were slave states where slavery was legal and common, more or less common, but they did not secede from the Union. So those are border states. So the Civil War, a lot of the fighting happens in the South, some in the North. In Pennsylvania, we have Gettysburg. Of course, that's a famous Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg. Um, I don't know what this map here is, but a lot of the fighting happened in the South. Okay. Um, Here's some famous battles, almost all of them in the southern states. Okay. I'm not one to like really focus on battles and generals and that sort of thing. It's interesting, but if you're going to learn history, you know, I like to, especially with you guys, we're just covering like the big ideas, right?
Right.
So those battles and generals and troop movements and numbers and things and dates, it's fun, it's cool, but not the biggest information that we need to cover here today. Um, so the Civil War is 4 years. It ends in 1865. Let's get back here. 1865 it ends in I think April 1865, and uh, so then you have the end of the war. During that time period, who was president during the Civil War?
Lincoln.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so during and he was president like for almost the exact time period of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Southern states seceded partly in reaction to Lincoln being elected. If he had
Uh-huh.
lost the election and the other guy, I forget who it was, had won, the Southern states would have been more happy with that guy, with that candidate, and they maybe wouldn't have seceded, and history would have played out differently. But Lincoln wins. He's from the North. He wins. He has certain views that the South doesn't like, doesn't trust. So because he becomes president, the South secedes. He's also then assassinated, I think, 1 week after the Civil War ends. So his
Uh-huh.
presidency is almost exactly the length of the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
But before he died in January of 1865, he was pushing very hard to get the 13th Amendment passed. The 13th Amendment, as it says here, ends slavery. We're going to talk about the three Civil War or Reconstruction amendments: 13th, 14th, 15th. The
Okay.
13th Amendment ends slavery, makes it illegal. Well, let's actually look at the text. Um, let's look at the wording. 13th. Okay, 13th Amendment says,
Mm.
so it's very short. That's it right there. Neither
Mm.
slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So they do keep it as a punishment. Shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So they outlaw slavery. So it ends 300 years, 250 years of slavery of Africans and African Americans in the United States. That's a big deal. Okay, that's going to immediately affect millions of people's lives, the economy. All those former slaves then have to, where do they go? Where are they going to live? Are they going to live on the plantation where they were previously owned by somebody, enslaved by somebody? Like they have to. There's all these questions, right? Or what kind of job are you going to get? You've been separated by your family. Are you now going to go find that family? Okay, so it's just a crazy change, right? The 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment. Um, let's see. The 14th Amendment is 1866, so a year later, a little bit longer. It says all persons born or naturalized, right, become a citizen in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunity of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So all persons born in or naturalized in the United States are citizens. It doesn't say no matter what race you are, but the implication here is they don't say, they're not specifying race one way or the other, right? It says all persons. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the US and the state wherein they reside. So it doesn't specifically mention the former slaves, but this, everybody understood, it applies to the former slaves. And it goes on. There are more details. I don't know exactly what all these other sections are, but that's obviously the big part. So the 14th Amendment then makes those former slaves citizens. That's 1866. The 15th Amendment, the last one, let me see if we're 10, 11, well, let me scroll down. Come on. Well, let me get there. Oh, here we go. The 15th Amendment, 1869, says, also very short, the right of citizens, now we've redefined who is a citizen, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of, now here it clearly says, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Race, color, or previous condition of servitude, specifically saying those former slaves. So a state, the federal government or a state government cannot make a law that limits the right to vote of any citizen. Now, I'm not clear on why this doesn't apply to women, but in 1869, it did not apply to women, right? Even white women, no women could vote until 1919 with the, what was that, the 20th Amendment. So to my eyes, this would apply to women, right? It says the right of citizens, but it doesn't. I don't know exactly why it doesn't, but it doesn't. But it does say, or previous condition of servitude, explicitly saying those former slaves. You can't bar them for that reason or any reason. Okay, so these are the three Reconstruction amendments. Okay, now let's look at the overview. I probably could have just done this first and saved you all the trouble. So it says overview. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, 1865, ended slavery, and slavery's end meant newfound freedom for African Americans. During the period of Reconstruction, this is called Reconstruction, some 2,000 African Americans held government jobs. Okay, that's a big deal, right? These former slaves, or not all Black people back then were slaves. You had freedmen, people who had either been one way or the other had been freed out of slavery. They did exist, and in some areas it was up to 10% of the Black population was non-enslaved freedmen, and they may maybe they get a full education and are fully powerful members of society, but they're not holding government jobs. So now during this period, there's 2,000 African Americans holding government jobs. The Black family, the Black church, and education were central elements in the lives of post-emancipation African Americans. To be emancipated means to be freed, right? So they were emancipated. And it says many African Americans lived in desperate rural poverty across the South in the decades following the Civil War. So those are kind of the things we're going to look at here. So let's preview this reading. Emancipation, promise, and poverty, right? The promise of freedom. You're now a United States citizen, and yet that doesn't mean you're automatically going to get a house and a paycheck, right? Just because your status has changed, actually although I'm not saying slavery is good, I'm saying what followed, if yesterday you were a slave and today you're not, that doesn't mean all your problems are solved, right? In some ways, again, not saying slavery was good, but in some ways it introduces different problems. Like now, where are you going to get your food and money and shelter, right? So it just creates, it's like we're going to read, promise and poverty. Then family, faith, and education. There's kind of the three pillars of African American culture at that time. And then Reconstruction, we'll talk a little bit about the politics of it and how it worked. And then Unfortunately, we end with the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and the end of Reconstruction. The time period ends that we call the Reconstruction ends at 1877. So we're going to look at, it's going great and things are great. And across the South, there's 2,000 black men in government jobs, but it does end. And America then takes a big step backwards in progress. So we're going to look at that and exactly how does it come to end. Unfortunately, they made great strides forward, and then America, as America often does, undid some of that progress and sort of slipped backwards. So we'll do this reading. That's kind of a preview of what we're going to look at. The Reconstruction it's a really interesting time period that, again, a lot of people, some people have never heard about, right? Because the way our classes are taught, and that everybody knows that slaves were freed after the Civil War, but some people think that it was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War that freed the slaves, and that mentioned it did say that it freed the slaves, but it didn't actually free the slaves. It was the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. So a lot of people have misconceptions about that. So let's jump in, do some reading. We'll talk as we go. Okay. Olawakimi, could you read paragraph 1 for us?
Okay. Emancipation, promise and poverty. For Africans, just a moment, please. Okay. Yeah. Emancipation, promise and poverty. For African Americans in the South, life after slavery was a world transformed. Gone were the brutalities and indignities of slave life. The whipping and sexual assault, the selling and forcible relocation of family members, the denial of education, wages, legal marriage, home ownership, and more. African Americans celebrated their newfound freedom, both privately and in public gatherings.
Okay, so yes, it was a good thing. Let me enlarge this a little bit. Let me see. Let's try that. That'll be
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah. Okay. So it is undeniably a good thing that slavery ends, but it doesn't solve all the problems in the lives of Black people. But it is a good thing, right? Yeah. So Monique, could you read paragraph 2?
But life in the years after slavery also proved to be difficult. Although slavery was over, the brutalities of white racial prejudice persisted. After slavery, state governments across the South instituted laws known as Black Codes. These laws granted certain legal rights to Blacks, including the right to marry, own property, and sue in court. But the codes also made it legal for Blacks to serve on juries, testify against whites, or serve in the state militia. The Black Codes also required Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers to sign annual labor contracts with white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested and hired out for work.
Okay. So yeah, across the South, like every state and town started passing Black codes. Okay. Um, we're going to talk about sharecroppers, but let's kind of preview that. Imagine you yesterday were a slave. Today, 13th Amendment comes out. Today, you're not a slave. You need a place to live. You need a job. You need some way to provide for yourself and your family. You need to keep yourself and your family safe, right? So, but if you depending now, there's all different kinds of slaves. When we think of slaves, we think of generally, those folks working in fields, right? And that's what the next picture is. They're picking cotton, right? And I forget, I used to know like what percentage of slaves in the South were field slaves, and then, but you do have a good fraction, a quarter of slaves not working in fields. Maybe they're working in a blacksmith shop, being an assistant. They're working, or if maybe even in a shop, like helping an accountant. In some way, or just being what we'd call a house slave, helping around the house. Um, Picture all the different jobs people do today. If you used a slave either to do that job or to assist you in doing that job, there's all different skills that these African Americans would have the moment they're freed from slavery. But you then need to take that knowledge that you have that day, when the 13th Amendment passes, and like that's it, right? Um, if you were picking cotton, that's what you know how to do. If you were working in a shoe store, helping somebody make shoes, then that's what you know how to do. If you were a slave to a white family raising their kids, then that's the skills that you have, is babysitting children, raising children. Um, so now you've got to go then find a job, right? The sharecroppers, talks about sharecroppers and tenant farmers. There is a large portion of the black population on that day that the 13th Amendment freed them, that the skills they had were working on a farm, working on a plantation. And so that's what they need to go forward doing. Look at it from the white person's, the white slave owner's perspective. If yesterday I owned 100 slaves and today I don't, right? My crops don't know that. I still need to work my farm. So the solution for both of these parties, the black man that's suddenly free but without a job, and the white man that is suddenly without any free labor of workers, was they got back together, and but under new conditions, right? So, well, let's just jump in. Let me read paragraph 3. I keep getting ahead of myself. It says most Southern Black Americans, though free, lived in desperate rural poverty. Having been denied education and wages under slavery, ex-slaves were often forced by the necessity of their economic circumstances to rent land from former white slave owners, from their own former owners. You're free. You have the dignity. You're now a free man, a free woman, and yet you got to go back to your former owner and say, "Hey, can I have a job?" It says these sharecroppers paid rent on the land by giving a portion of their crop to the landowner. So the plantation owner, if he owned 100 acres and 100 slaves, he would then rent that acreage, those farm fields, back to his former slaves quite often. And they would live there and they'd work the land, but they'd pay the white landowner rent. So they were called the black and quite often very poor white people were in the same situation. They were called sharecroppers or tenant farmers. A tenant is somebody renting a place to live, right? So if they were renting, quite often they're renting the land that they used to work as slaves from their former slave owner. It's very common to do that, which couldn't have made you feel very good about your situation. Although, at least you're free and not a slave, right? But who has all the power in that situation? The former slave or the former slave owner? Who has more power in that new situation?
The Pumas?
Owner, yeah,
Yeah, the
farmer
former owner,
owner.
right? He's got the land.
Mhm.
He's got the ability to give you a job, right? And that's exactly how it played out. For the majority of former slaves, it says they were as a slave, it was illegal to teach a slave to read.
Mm.
So they had no education, formal education.
Hmm.
They had limited skills, and so their options were very limited.
Hmm.
Um, Jendai, could you read paragraph 4? Jendai, you there? Okay, we'll come back to Jendai.
I'm sorry. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. Okay, maybe you were muted there. Yeah, could you read paragraph 4 for us?
In a few places in the South, former slaves seized land from former slave owners in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But federal troops quickly restored this land to the white landowners. A movement among Republicans in Congress to provide land to former slaves was unsuccessful. Former slaves were never compensated for their enslavement.
Okay, what does it mean to compensate somebody?
Compensate.
Give them money toward their position that they previously been in. Like we compensate people in suits
Yeah.
with
Generally
monetary.
means being paid money, right? To compensate, even when you get paid for a job, you are being compensated for your work.
Right.
So, or sometimes it can be to repay a wrong, in this case, kind of. So former slaves were never compensated for their enslavement. They were set free, but freed into, as I've said, not equally, but
Not you. Yeah.
also crappy conditions, right?
Yeah.
Unfair conditions. Um, so they did, and in a few places in the South, they seized land from their former slave owners, um, which must have been very satisfying. And yet, then federal troops, the U.S. troops, come in and restore the land because yes, I see why you'd want to do that as a former slave. It does seem fair. Slavery has been unfair for 250 years, and yet, you can't have a country where people just storm land and take land. So, the government, the military has to restore order. It's just, it's the way it has to be. So, it says some Republicans in Congress tried to provide land to former slaves. That didn't really get off the ground. So, that poor sharecropper was very common. Was very common. Um, so we go into family, faith, and education. Family, church, and school became centers of Black life after slavery. With slavery's end, Black women often preferred to be homemakers, though poverty pushed many back into the workforce. Black churches became centerpieces of African American culture and community, not only as places of personal spiritual renewal and communal worship, but also as centers for learning, socializing, and political organization. Black ministers were community leaders. So that the family and the church were pillars of African American culture. Ruby, could you read paragraph 7?
Okay, thanks. African Americans' desire for education found expression in the establishment of schools at every level, from grade schools for basic education to the founding of the nations. First, Black college such as how to say this
Fisk.
risk University and Harvard University. The Freeman's Bureau 1865 to 1870s. A government agency established the 8 former slaves overseas. Some 300,000, yes,
3,000.
school
Yeah.
or 3,000 school across the South and ran hospitals and healthcare facilities for the freemen.
Okay. So freedmen during the Civil War, during slavery, freedmen would refer to any African American who was not a slave, and that in some places it was up to 10% of the black population were not slaves. After the Civil War, when all slaves were free, they're all called freedmen. And so you have a government agency, which was a very big deal at the time, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was entirely focused on helping this situation, helping them be successful. And I think that was largely the driving force for the attempt to get land to former slaves. They built schools, ran hospitals, healthcare facilities. The Freedmen's Bureau was, for the short time that it was a thing, was a pretty good thing for the country and for that portion of the country that had previously been slaves. And here's an old, well, it says at the top, it says Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, 1866.
Classroom.
Yeah, it's a classroom, and we see two
Mhm.
white women teaching all these different kids. Now it looks like some kids are taller and shorter, older and younger, so it's a a
Right.
mixed classroom, and
Mhm.
what we think of today as a one-room schoolhouse sort of situation.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and if this was on the GED test, the high set test, you could have some kind of good question about the two white women teaching the classroom of African American kids, and make some implication about the roles of the different people here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I mean, this is an engraving from in a
Mhm.
newspaper in 1866.
Right. The dress here remind me when I watched the uh, um, Little House in the Paris, right? The
Yeah,
teacher Dora, she dressed like that.
yeah, Little House on the Prairie. Yeah, I mean, these are giant hoop skirts.
Right.
Down in the South at that time, that's what they wore.
Yes.
Even in the summer, you'd be
Right.
wearing
Right.
quite a lot. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Um, Guisha, do you want to read paragraph 8?
Okay. During the period of Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, Congress passed and enforced laws that promoted civic and political rights for African Americans across the South. Most notable among the laws Congress passed were three amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment, 1865, ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, great,
Guaranteed.
guarantee African Americans the rights of American citizenship, and the 15th
Amendment.
Amendment 1870 guaranteed black men the constitutional right to vote.
Okay, thank you. So we've discussed those. The dates they give is a little bit different than what I saw, because I think the date that I saw online was the date that it was passed by Congress. But then, if you remember, if we've talked about amendments in the past, it's passed by Congress, but then it has to be ratified by the states. And I think it's as soon as 2/3 of however many states there are at that time, 2/3 of the states pass, approve that amendment, then it takes effect, then it becomes law. So the dates I saw, I think, were the dates that it passed. Do I still have it up? Yeah. It says passed by Congress. This is the 15th Amendment. Passed by Congress 1869, ratified just about 1 year later, 1870. So it's passed by Congress, but then they send it out to the states. Each state individually votes on it. And it wouldn't be you and me, citizens of Pennsylvania. It would be our state legislators in Harrisburg, I believe, would sit down and vote thumbs up, thumbs down, yes or no, on the amendment. So when 2/3 of the states do that, then it becomes a law. So that's what these dates here are for. And so we've talked about those three. Olubakimi, could you read? Let me see. Yeah, could you read paragraph 9?
Okay. African Americans actively took up the rights, opportunities, and responsibilities of citizenship. During Reconstruction, 700 African American men served in elected public office. Among them, 2 United States senators and 14 members of the United States House of Representatives. Another 1,300 African American men and women had appointed government jobs.
Okay, so thank you. So it says at the beginning, 2,000 African Americans served in government jobs. 700 held elected public office. Okay, 2 United States senators, that's a big deal. 14 members of the House of Representatives, that's a big deal. And then the rest would be, that's only, 16 out of 700. The rest would be local, either state legislators, like we elect people to do our state government in Harrisburg, right? Across the South, they're electing state people, or maybe like your town's mayor or something like that, but elected public office. And that's a good thing, because that means that those African Americans, former slaves, are now showing up to vote, right? And it means that the if an African American becomes either your town mayor or your state senator, that means that the majority of people in that town or that state approve of a black man representing them, right? So that's progress. That wasn't going to happen before the Civil War in the 1820s, 1840s, 1850s. So the fact that they're elected, right, elected by citizens, is a very big deal. Then you have another 1,300, 1,300 people that are appointed to government jobs, right? Just like the president appoints, President Biden appoints his own, nominates his own Secretary of State, right? There some government jobs you are appointed to. You're not elected. You're chosen by the person who was elected. So there's another 1,300 black men and women. I'd be interested to know more about that. Appointed to government jobs. Okay.
That date is before the 1877 or just the 1870?
Well, I guess it would have to be. It would have to be after 1870. Well, I don't know. I don't know. This is before 1877, because as we're going to see in a few minutes when we get there in the reading, 1877, this all kind of falls apart again. And the period we call Reconstruction ends at 1877. Doesn't mean it's all undone, right? The slaves are still free. Black men can still vote. Black people are still citizens. But some of the progress, like all these people being elected to elected positions, a lot of that progress is going to disappear, unfortunately. So this is a photograph of Hiram Revels. He was of Mississippi, became the first African-American man elected to the U.S. Senate. Now, we hold the Senate people think of the Senate as a little bit higher, a little bit more prestigious than the House of Representatives. So to be elected to the Senate is a very big deal, you know. And think of that moment when a former, I don't know, I can't say if he was a former slave. I don't know if he was a former slave, but you know, maybe he wasn't. But a black man, you know, entering that chamber as an elected United States senator, that must have been a pretty big moment.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
yeah. It says, led by Republicans in Congress, the federal government insisted on civil and political rights for African Americans in the face of fierce resistance by Southern whites. Federal military occupation of the defeated Confederacy ensured African Americans civil and political rights. So the whites in the South were not thrilled about, you know, we can be happy today and former slaves can be happy, and many white people were happy that this progress was being made. But a good portion of white people in the South, particularly those whose livelihoods were affected, right? If you were a big plantation owner with 100 slaves, your life got harder. And maybe, you know, maybe I hope if you're a good person, you'd be you'd be happy about it. Although maybe not, because you were, you know, yesterday you were a slave owner. So the chances of you now being happy are pretty low, right? So
Right.
Southern whites, especially those elected, those representing the people of the South in the Senate and the House of Representatives, they pushed back against this. And so Republicans in Congress, largely northern state Republicans, push to protect the civil and political rights, and the representatives from the South are fighting against that. Now, the federal troops, that Union Army that ended the Civil War in the South, they stayed there and they occupied the South, that former Confederacy, the states that tried to form the other country of the Confederacy. That federal occupation, the Union troops, America's military stayed in the South to kind of just keep the peace, right? If we fight, you know, if you're you're in charge of the Union military. We fought a war, we fought the Confederates, they lost, and then in addition to them losing, we set all their slaves free. Well, if we then disappear and go home up to the north, do you think they're going to treat their slaves fairly? No way, right? So the Union Army stayed in the South and kind of flexed its muscle and made sure that it says ensured the African Americans civil and political rights. Okay, so which, if you live in the South, if you're say a white person in the South, you just lost the war, so you hate that. Your slaves were freed, so you hate that. And then the Union military that beat you in that war is still living in your town and in your face, and you know, enforcing these drastic changes in society. So they were quite often not very happy about that. So now let's look at the ramifications, the outcomes of that. It says the KKK and the end of Reconstruction. From the late 1860s, white supremacists in the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, terrorized African American leaders and citizens in the South until in 1871, the U.S. Congress passed legislation that resulted in the arrest and imprisonment of Klan leaders and the end of the Klan's terrorism of Americans for a time. Not forever, but for a while. So it says late 1860s, 1871. So for a few years, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was very powerful, very influential, and very present in people's lives in the South. They terrorized African American leaders and citizens. You have a lot of people's houses being burned down. If you were maybe one of those black elected leaders, you're in danger. Your family's in danger, right? There's a lot of lynchings, thousands of lynchings, hangings in the South. of black people by white mobs, by angry crowds of white people. But in 1871, Congress passed a law. The military and police enforced it, and it did beat back, kind of crush down the KKK terrorism, because it was just terrorism is what it was. It says, but over the course of the late 1860s and through the 1870s, the federal government's military presence was withdrawn from various southern states. And with the Compromise of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the last federal troops in the South to withdraw. So that's what happens. 1877, I don't remember the exact details of it, but because I think it had to do with an election, and like there was a very close election. Again, I don't remember the details, but because of some election, they kind of made, some people made a deal, and they said, okay, well, we will let. They gave. I think what happened was they let like a northerner win a very close election. But in order to do so, they kind of dialed back a lot of this progress in the South. And so President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the last federal troops in the South to withdraw. So what happens is, like I said, those federal troops, the Union Army troops, were the only thing standing between the former slaves and the former slave owners. So you take them away, and things are going to get real bad real quick for those black people, former slaves in the South, right? And people knew that at the time. People said, what are you doing? This is terrible, right? To the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. But it was a deal that was made. It was a bad deal, an immoral deal. And again, I don't remember all the details of the Compromise of 1877. But because of that, it kind of ended all the Reconstruction. It didn't change the laws. Those 3 amendments stayed. But all the progress and any amount of safety in the lives of former slaves living in the South kind of fell apart. It says, with no troops to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, Reconstruction was at an end. Across the South, lynching, disenfranchisement, which is when you take away somebody's right to vote or ability to vote, disenfranchisement, and segregationist laws became widespread. Segregation is, right, which we see up into the 1950s, 1960s. We see segregation, separation of black people and white people in society. So it becomes widespread. It would not be until after the Second World War and the 1960s civil rights movement that Jim Crow segregation would be outlawed. So because the president said he made a deal, I don't remember the deal, but because of that Compromise of 1877, they removed the Union troops from the South. And so, again, it doesn't change the 14th and 15th Amendments, but it made things much harder. So instead of saying to former slaves, to black people, to all black people, former slave or not, instead of saying to them, you can't vote because you're black, they would make all kinds of crazy laws that would restrict their ability to vote. The simplest was you had to be able to read to vote. Okay. Which you could say, okay, well, that makes sense, right? But the Constitution doesn't say people who can read can vote. It says anybody, any citizen can vote, right? But towns and states across the South would have reading tests. And here's a passage, and you show up to vote on election day, and you have to read this before you can, you have to sit in front of a white person, and you have to be able to read before I hand you a ballot and you can vote. And sometimes, just to make it fun, it wouldn't be in English. They'd give you something in Latin or some other language, and you have to be able to read that, right? Or The craziest law I've ever heard of was and this was a law in a town. I don't know where it was. You had to guess the number of bubbles on a bar of soap before you
Oh,
could vote.
no.
Right? How are you going to get that right? Is there even a right number? They just put up these utter nonsense laws to
Mhm.
block African Americans from voting, right? They couldn't change the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, but they could pass local laws. And without those Union troops there to enforce it, the South did its own thing. The white people in the South did their own thing, and it all just kind of fell apart. So, and that includes lynching, right? Just hunting down, chasing down black people and hanging them, disenfranchisement, taking away somebody's ability to vote, and segregationist laws became widespread. So, the Reconstruction era is famous for those 2,000 people, black people, many of them former slaves, who made it to government office, either elected or appointed, right? We can hold that up as the success of and the three constitutional amendments as the success of the Reconstruction period. But then it falls apart,
Mm.
and from 1877 up until the 1960s in the civil
Mhm.
rights movement, and today, I mean, you can still argue we haven't exactly solved all those problems yet.
Mhm.
Um, that progress, great progress, shining progress for a decade, and then it slides back, and that seems to be how American history works sometimes. Um, but that is the Reconstruction period. It's the 10, 12, 13 years after the Civil War, um, most notably for those three Reconstruction amendments, and the progress that was made. But then hand in hand with that progress goes how the progress was undone, right?
Mhm.
Um, so it's an interesting period of time. Any questions about this?
No.
No. Again, I learned also all American what histories.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good.
Mhm.
Anybody else learn something new?
Yes.
Yeah, this for me is new.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some people don't like, and I wish we didn't have to talk, but some people don't like to talk about to think that race and slavery is so central to American history, but it really is. Now you can get out there and there's all kinds of history that doesn't involve the relationship between black America and white America, but I mean to pretend that it isn't hasn't been a central feature to American history from the beginning and into today, I think isn't really looking at the full picture of history.
Yes.
Now, not all of
You'd
it's,
be cheating yourself if you didn't.
yeah. I mean, I don't believe America is an evil country. We don't have an evil history. There's full of good people and bad people, good decisions and bad decisions.
Right.
Um, but this is a central theme, a central thread in the fabric of our country. I mean, it
Yeah.
just is.
We did the same thing when we first came here. We took
Right.
it from the indigenous people.
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
We
that's
enslaved them.
which we don't talk about nearly as much.
No
But
one ever talks about it.
right.
Mm.
Right.
And that was our beginning. So it should be not a surprise when people try to brush under the middle. And,
Yeah.
it's just kind of, if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist.
Right. Now
That's
I
a very
don't
old
know.
mentality.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I don't know. It's a immensely complex question,
Oh,
right? Like, what do you do now with a portion of the country? Let's say in 1866, should they have should they have repaid? I mean, you couldn't, but should they have made some sort of monetary or land, or should they have made some effort to get all those former slaves up on their feet in society? You know, if something had been done back then, would it be different now? I don't know.
I don't know,
you know?
because would it have been perceived as an insult? Because
Right, yeah.
freedom and a little piece of land. I don't know how much land it would take me to feel compensated. Right. You know, I mean, honestly, I like, to be really honest, how much land would it take for me to feel compensated if you imprisoned me, tortured me, enslaved me, stole my family from me? I mean, if you're looking at giving me, me personally, just I'm a person, I'm going to be so offended on so many levels that maybe half of your country isn't even enough for me. I mean, so it would be unrealistic to say how much is your freedom measured.
Right.
It would be insulting.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a
know
really
the
hard
answer.
question because I don't know. But I will tell you this fun fact: Hiram Revels was born into a free family. He was not a slave.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I had to look that up when you didn't know. I was like, wait a second, was he a slave? I'm like,
Yeah,
I needed to know. But yeah, he was born into a free family.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which that's really nice. Mm-hmm. Not everybody had that opportunity.
Right. Now it'd be interesting to dig deeper into that, into those, say, 700 people who were elected. I'm sure some of them were former slaves, but probably not many, maybe not many. I don't know, because a former slave isn't going to have a great deal of education. You could, I'm sure there's tons of history out there, books about those 700 people elected to 2 senators, 14 House of Representatives. What states do they represent? What are their personal stories? All kinds of interesting stuff. But this is one portion of history that a lot of people, you go ask 100 people in your town what they know about the Reconstruction, and they're not even going to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, they won't even know.
Yeah. So it's an interesting period.
They touch on it. Well, they did when I was a kid. History is not the same as when I was in 8th grade or 9th grade. So, but I had an extraordinary history teacher. So if you went into his class, didn't matter. You had an A, you had to keep it. If you failed for any reason, he would give you portions of history that you weren't familiar with. And he'd send you to the library and he'd say, I want you to do a full report. Come back and tell us something we don't know that's not in our books. Yeah. And he would move your grade back up to an A. He was a really great teacher. And so we got to touch on this as youth, but not long.
Right.
Not long. We'll talk about maybe a week, where the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, that was like the whole year, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll send this out, and this is I copied this from, as I did last week. I like some of these Khan Academy articles. They have an overview. They have, I changed some things, but I'd leave it intact mostly. And I left in some of these hyperlinks. Like if you click on the Civil War, it'll take you to another Khan Academy reading about the Civil War. So I'll leave those hyperlinks in there. I'll send this out. You can, go ahead and dig deeper. If you come across a topic, a person, a time period, an event that you think would be cool for us to dig into for a week or in class, let me know. And we'll just pick up next week and do something different. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Matt.
All right.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great day. Thanks for logging in.
All right. Well, I'll see you next week. Okay.
All right. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the weather.
Yes. Enjoy.
Everybody enjoy it. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Matt.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.